Well, Lee, welcome to today's event. First of all, just tell us a little bit about your journey at Amplify Church.
Yes, it's an honor to be with you, Tony, and with those who you're working together with. I started Amplify Church actually in the late 70s. And so Amplify Church started as a home Bible study. And that was the early part of my life in my 20s and early 30s. And then I left the ministry and ended up in a couple different leadership development roles in the corporate world. And in 2003, I was called by one of the board members of Amplify Church, and they said, hey, the church is on its last legs. It is got one foot in the grave. It's an aging, dying church. Would you consider coming back into ministry? And so in 2003, I went back as the senior pastor of Amplify Church. Then it was a church of about 150 people, which sounds like a lot, but it's not very many people when we were on a 50,000 square foot campus on 20 acres of ground. And wow. I think the biggest issue was that the average age of those who were in attendance was well over 50 and getting older every year. And so I put into place a change strategy that the board bought into, and so did the staff, the growing staff as time went on. And in 15 years, the church grew from an aging, dying church of 150 to a multi-generational church of 2,000 that I handed off to my successor 2 years ago.
Lee, in this session, we've talked about DTR moments, define the reality moments. It's those opportunities for leaders to define the reality when they sense change is needed. And I'm just curious, I mean, it sounds like that's part of what you had to do at Amplify Church to define the reality preceding some significant changes that you made in the ministry when you returned.
Yes, I think the big reality that we really defined and really looked at was just the fact that these were people who were there who loved God. They loved Christ, but their children did not go to church with them. Their grandchildren did not go to church with them. And so the reality was, if what this church has meant to you is going to continue to reach the next generation, we don't have to change our vision, our mission, our beliefs, our values, but we do have to change how we approach church, because right now, our children have told us what they think about our church. They all left.
Yeah, that's for sure. And as someone now, I mean, you said well into your 50s earlier, and I was thinking, oh my goodness, he's talking about me now. But I don't know when the switch happened, but it happened at some point in the rearview mirror where it wasn't about me anymore. It wasn't what I enjoyed most in church. It wasn't, the teaching that I preferred, the music that I preferred. It became more about my kids being engaged. And I can foresee it's not going to be too far into the future, I hope, where I'm concerned about my grandkids as well. But that perspective begins to change, and we begin to realize it's not about us. It's about these next generations, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that the biggest mindset change that had to happen, and it didn't take a long time, but it was a lot of Sunday morning messages related to it. But the biggest change had to be, if it was good enough for me, it's good enough for my children. That statement to a question: what will it take to reach our children? What will it take to reach the next generation? And the people of the church pretty much embraced that. They weren't all excited when we started to do the things necessary to change our approach to church. But the principle that, without that mindset change, we didn't stand a chance.
So when I'm working with a church and I realize that they're stuck, one of the most common reasons, I think, is that the way they've done church becomes more important than why they're doing church. And before I can help a church start to rethink their ministry strategies, we kind of have to go back to the why, and we have to clarify what the new win looks like. And you've started to allude to what that looked like at Amplify Church, but how did you navigate the conversations to get to the place where your staff, your lay leaders, ultimately your congregation were bought into this new win, if you will?
Yeah, and for me, the new win, it was a little tough. Obviously, in the Northeast, it's a little different than other parts of the country. Pittsburgh's a little different than other places in the Northeast. So you can't do apples to apples to say, we need to reach this size or this number of people attending to be a win. To me, the win was to go from a church that had very few young adults, very few children, to a multi-generational church, not an old church to a young church, a church that was truly multi-generational. It's not too hard when you look at scriptures where Paul talking about older men and younger men, or older women and younger women, to know that the scriptures, and Paul assumed when he's writing that the church was multi-generational. And so what I was encouraging people to say is, look, the average age of our community is 35. The average age of our church is well over 50. We're not reaching our community for Christ. And so I think there was this sense of, if we're going to reach our community, rather than just a declining number of older members of our community, then we have got to make some shifts.
Lee, it seems like one of the challenges for leaders as they're trying to lead change is they have a picture of what the better future looks like, but the people that they're leading don't have that picture yet. And I have to think, in the situation that you walked back into, that might have been a challenge for you as a leader. So how did you help people get a picture of what the future could look like, and start to build buy-in for some of the changes that were going to be necessary? Because it's one thing to want to be a multi-generational church, a church that our kids and grandkids want to be a part of. It's another thing to actually go through all those changes, because some of that had to be pretty painful for some folks.
Yes. I think there's no better way than to go see what a multi-generational church looks like. And so actually, my wife and I funded a trip for all of the board members and their spouses to Atlanta, and that's where we had moved from as members of North Point Community Church. And we took them to North Point, and we said, we don't want you to look at this as something we need to copy, but I want you to see what a multi-generational church that shakes a city looks like. And as they went through the children's areas, the youth areas, and when they went into church and saw families worshiping together of all ages, it shook them to the core. And they actually went from a lot of question marks as far as, do we even want to do this? Because the fact is, when you start a change effort in the church, the people you're starting with are already happy with the way things are, or they wouldn't be there. And so it was, but they shifted to say, oh, so this is what it looks like. And, and it really was a defining moment for those who I really needed on our board of directors. Then they were able to become evangelists, as it were, to others in the church, to say, you can't believe where we're going.
Yeah, that's so encouraging. Okay, and speaking of encouragement, what encouragement would you bring to pastors and church leaders that are watching today? They're trying to build alignment on their team. What encouragement would you give to them as they're trying to increase that alignment so that everybody's pulling in the same direction?
Well, I think particularly now we're kind of coming out of a phase where a lot of what our leadership is about is survival. And, how do we make sure that we are able to hold church under the circumstances we've had in the past year or so, to really that new visioning, and be able to say, okay, where do we go from here? And for us, that vision was really about, how do we reach the next generation? And I talk about a few things in the book for a New Generation, about what we did to kind of mobilize people around that common vision. But what we did is we started to talk from the beginning. How do we reach our community? And how do we reach the next generation in our community? And my weekend messages primarily revolved around those two topics, probably for a year. And our staff meetings revolved around those two topics probably for a year until there was a sense of alignment of, yes, we will be a next generation church. We will be a multi-generational church, and we will do whatever it takes to get there. Now that we except change our beliefs and kind of our core values, but and we reached that place with the staff, with the board, with the congregation. But it was a lot of one-on-one discussions, some field trips, but a lot of weekend messages that instead of rotating from one topic to another, my topics were a lot in that first year or two around reaching the next generation for Christ.
Yeah, and that might be good to hear. This transition, it wasn't days or weeks, was it?
No, I'd say it was probably a few months before that it really started to kick in as far as adopting a new mindset. But as far as really implementing the changes, any major change effort takes about 2 years to really kick in. And so within that first 2 years, the vast majority of the changes that we needed to make, we did make. And I'm a big believer in decisive change rather than slow incremental change, which can be torturous for everybody involved. And so we pulled the trigger on a lot of changes in those first 2 years, while preaching, as you were saying, Tony, about the whys. Why are we doing this? Not just what are we doing, but why are we doing this? And as long as that why was out there, then we had the benefit of the doubt from at least a lot of the church members about what we were doing.
So Lee wrote about this transition at Amplify Church in his book, For a New Generation. And it's a great resource. If you are sensing that your church is needing to go through a pretty significant change, just watching how he led his church through this and the steps that they took over that 2-year period. In fact, at the end of the book, there's a chart that kind of details change by change when you implemented some of these shifts that took place in your ministry. It's a great resource. It's not the topic for today's conversation, Lee, but would you share a little bit more about, we were talking prior to our recording today about your new book that's coming out, because I think some leaders might be interested in this as well.
Yeah, I think the last 2 years that I was there, which would have been starting about 4 years ago, we put a formal transition plan in for my successor, who had been with me for almost 15 years. So he was not new to the church. But we did put a formal transition plan, worked with our friends at Vanderbloemen, and be able to put that plan together. And so it was actually Good Friday of 2 years ago that the formal handoff took place. And there are a number of things that were important. One was that I wasn't just handing off the baton, but I was taking another baton, a different baton, for what God had for this next season of my life and ministry. And so it was a seamless transition. The church is healthy and strong, but my role has shifted from senior pastor to senior cheerleader. And just about 100% of what I do is serve as an encourager and a cheerleader for this next generation of leaders who are leading the church.
That's positive. And so I'm looking forward to reading more about that part of your journey in your new book coming out as well. Thank you, Lee, for joining us today.
Thank you, Tony. God bless you and those who are working together to learn to lead more effectively.